Hi there. We've been talking about James 1, particularly the verse that says that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Up till now, I've been focusing on the idea of the testing of your faith, and that when God gives us a trial, we need to respond to that, not just in obedience, but in obedience that comes from faith. We need to be walking in the Spirit, abiding in Him, not just amping up the self-control and powering it through on my own in the flesh, but really relying on God. And in that way, my faith grows, and as my faith grows, my endurance grows, and as my endurance grows, my character changes, and I become more like Christ. Today I want to focus a little bit, begin for a couple of weeks, to focus on the word endurance, that the testing of your faith, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. So let me make several points. First of all, I mentioned this before, but the word for testing and tempting are the same Greek word, pyraxis. So when and that's confusing, because on the one hand, we know that God will test us, but we also know it says later in James 1 that He won't tempt us. But if it's the same word, what is it talking about? Well, you have to go a little bit by context and a little bit by understanding what the point is. The point is that when I'm tempted to be angry, for example, it's always through the fact that there's a hardship going on. There's something that I'm trying to get away from, or something that I'm struggling with. God is always calling me to respond in faith and love. He's never behind the pull to sin, but He is often behind the hardship. God will allow things in our lives to test us so that we will respond in faith. Satan uses the same hardship to try to pull us away to respond in sin. So God is never behind the temptation in the sense that God never wants us to respond in sin. But God is very often behind the situation that brings the temptation. And that's the word here. The testing, the trial that is in our lives is the thing that makes it difficult for us to obey. And God allows that, or even brings it, but not so that we won't obey, so that we will trust Him and live by faith. All right, so here's the main thing that we've been looking at, is that our trials are tailor-made by God to make us more like Christ. It says that let endurance have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. God looks at my life, looks at my heart, sees that although I have grown a lot as a Christian, I have changed a lot, there's many things where I still need to change. He's given me a new nature, but that new nature hasn't necessarily permeated all the ways in which I live. It hasn't permeated all my thoughts, will, and emotions. And God wants to change who I am to make me more like His Son. So He notices the areas in which I'm still lacking things. He notices the areas in which I'm still not perfectly Christ-like, and there's many of them. And He knows in His wisdom what's the first and most important area to work on. And He will tailor-make specific trials to put me under pressure in that area, to help me to respond by faith, just one instance at a time in that area. And that will produce endurance, and the endurance will change who I am. The second thing I want to emphasize is that there are seasons of testing. In other words, there are some times when we don't face many trials at all and everything seems to be going really smoothly. And then there are times when we seem to face one trial after another. And it's important not to confuse spiritual maturity with simply a time of spiritual peacefulness. Sometimes I think I'm doing really well with the Lord, and it turns out all that was happening is just I wasn't facing a lot of trials. And other times I think I'm really sort of falling apart spiritually, and in fact what's happening is simply that I'm facing some intense trials. And so sometimes we need to just recognize that there are seasons of temptation and testing in our lives. There's seasons in which certain things are really difficult, and seasons in which they're not so difficult. And I want to talk about two aspects of that. First of all is when we face something new. Sometimes there's a certain trial or a certain temptation that I've never really faced in my life, and I think it's because I'm doing so well. And then I come to a place where God begins to let me face that struggle in a way that I never have before. And my first thought when that happens is to get really discouraged and think, wow, what has gone wrong? I've gone backwards. But often that's not what's happening. Often it's just that God is opening up a new level of growth for me by letting me face something I've never faced before. This happened in a very simple way when I was very young. As a high schooler and young college student, I had no worries about finances, just none. I was like, I can work at McDonald's for the rest of my life, and that's fine. I don't need to have money or riches or anything else. I didn't really care about it. And then when I got married and had a family, all of a sudden it was my responsibility to take care of my wife and my children. And all of a sudden I realized that working at McDonald's wouldn't be enough to do that. And I started worrying about finances. And I thought, what's wrong with my faith? I've lost all this faith I used to have. And then I realized it isn't that I had all this faith before so that I didn't have anything at stake before. And so what happened was I had a new season of my life and a new trial, a new temptation, a new difficulty, a new hardship. And God was using that to build in me faith at a deeper level than I had to have it before. So what felt to me like less faith, well, that was actually the opportunity to grow in faith, to trust God with my finances, not only for me now, but for my family. So that kind of thing happens a lot. And often, for me anyway, and I think I'm not the only one, when I face a trial that I haven't faced before, the temptation is to become demoralized and think, boy, I am just really falling apart here. But in fact, sometimes again, it's actually a sign that God is opening us up to a new area of hardship because he's opening us up to a new area of spiritual growth. And I had somebody once give me what he calls the graduation speech. He said, when you graduate from junior high school or middle school to high school, you move from being an upperclassman to being a lowerclassman, and suddenly everything gets hard again. When you graduate from high school to college, suddenly everything gets hard again. The year before you were a senior, everything was simple. You understood the classes were easy, you were popular maybe, and you were an upperclassman. Everything was simple. And then you get to college, and maybe it's a whole new ballgame. Everything's on another level. Things are difficult. You don't know your way around. You feel like a newbie. Same thing happens when you move to grad school or to a new job or anything else. And he said, what that means is, it doesn't mean you're suddenly failing. It means you graduated. God has said, you're done with the previous lesson. Let's move on to the next one. And every time God takes us to a new level in our spiritual learning, it's likely that it will be accompanied by a new level of spiritual hardship. So he used to say, congratulations, you've graduated. God thinks you're ready for this now. It says in 1 Corinthians 10 that God won't allow you to be tempted beyond that which you're able to endure. That doesn't mean by yourself. It means with God's help, of course. But he won't let you be tempted beyond that which you're able to endure. If he allows a temptation in your life, it's a sign that he thinks you're ready to handle it. Again, he doesn't want to pull you away to sin. He's never the author of the temptation in the sense of causing you to sin. But he's often the author of the hardship, which is the temptation for us. And so he often is saying, often we can take that and say, I must have graduated. God must think I'm at another level, at the next level of spiritual growth. And that's exciting. The second thing I wanted to mention is when we face something old. Sometimes we face a trial that we thought we'd already learned how to handle. There are times when this happened to me a few months ago. I started all of a sudden struggling with an old issue, an old temptation that I thought I'd completely defeated about 5 years ago. And suddenly it was back. And it sort of threw me for a couple weeks and maybe a couple months. I was like, I don't know what's going on here. What's wrong with me? And then I remembered what I'm teaching you today, that God sometimes brings back an issue that we thought was resolved. And it doesn't mean that we didn't make progress. To me, it felt like I made a lie out of all the progress I've made in the past 5 years. And then I realized, no, that's not what's going on. The first time this happened to me that I recall was I'd only been a Christian about 5 years, and I don't even remember what the issue was. But I remember there was some particular issue that I had battled and defeated and figured out how to live for Christ in, and then it went away and was no longer an issue. And then about a year later, it came back. And I was struggling with it again, and I remember again getting very demoralized, thinking, well, this means I never made any progress at all. And that morning, I was reading in my quiet time, and I read the verse 1 Peter 5:10, which says this, after you suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So there's 4 stages in Christian growth here. Perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish. When I first was reading this, I was confused as to why perfect was listed first, because perfect seems like that should be the last stage. Perfection should be the last thing to come. But the word perfection in Scripture doesn't usually mean what we think of as perfect. What it means is completeness. The idea is God perfects you by finding the areas in which you lack and completing your life a little bit more by finding something that you're missing and then filling it in. That's just like the James 1 verse where he says that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. He doesn't mean that you have no flaws. He means that you're well-rounded. He means that it's the work that he's doing is brought to completion, at least in some area. So here the perfection isn't an absolute perfection. It's that God takes some area in our lives and begins to work in it and begins to fill in that which is lacking. And then the next thing that it says, that's stage 1, he does that through trials. He does that by bringing us the opportunity to practice living by faith in that particular area. But then it says confirm. What is it to confirm something? It's to take something that you've already learned and teach it again. To take something you've already seen and show it to you again. So that's when the same trial comes back, a year later, a couple years later, and you face the same issue. And the first time it seemed really, really difficult, and you wrestled with God, and you finally yielded, and you were walking in the Spirit, and you believed, and you made a decision to surrender it to God, and it was taken care of. And now here it is a year later, and it's back, and it seems as hard as ever. But you know what? It isn't as hard as ever. It's easier the second time around, because you've been here before. But it's still a struggle. So you rework through the same stuff. You recommit your life to God in this area. You resubmit your heart to God in this area. You resurrender. You retrust. And you say, here, I'll do this again. And you do it again. And it hammers it home. It confirms it. It makes it more real in your life. And then guess what stage 3 is? Strengthen. Guess how he strengthens the same area in your life. Now that you've surrendered it to him, now that you've made it right with him, now that you've made the right decision, and then it's been confirmed you've made the right decision again, guess what he does to strengthen it? He gives it to you a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time. And every single time it comes around, you work through the same issues, you make the same decision to respond by faith, you respond in the same way, that is, hopefully you do. Sometimes you won't, sometimes you'll blow it and respond the wrong way and sin instead of trusting. But every time you do make a decision in the right direction, it strengthens that area in your life. It makes it more a part of you. It makes it something more characteristic of you. And it gets easier and easier as with each time that goes by, until finally it is established. And when it's established, it's the way it's supposed to be, and it can't be taken away very easily at all. It's pretty solid in your life. But we don't know where we are in the process. So we might think we've learned it, and God might say, you have no idea. You have a lot more to still go. But it means that, again, that when I see the same thing coming back in my life, I don't have to get discouraged. I can say, hey, God is confirming this truth in my life. He's strengthening this truth in my life. He wants to establish this in my life so that I will be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. C.S. Lewis talked about spirals versus circles. He said that often we feel like the Christian life is going in circles. We're just going around and around the same issues over and over again. And he says, no, what you're doing is you're spiraling upwards. So every year or so you come back to the same issue, but you're a level higher than you were before. And then back to the same issue again later, but you're a level higher than you were before. And so what feels to us like making no progress, if we're responding in faith every time it comes up, or as many times as we can when it comes up, every time we respond in faith, we're making progress. And it may spiral back around, but we're at a level higher than we were before. And spirals back around, and we're still at a level higher than we were before. The testing of your faith produces endurance, which means doing it again and again and again. There's a verse in Proverbs 24:16 that says, a righteous man falls 7 times and rises again, but the wicked stumble in time of calamity. Now, it's not talking about falling into sin there. It's talking about falling into misfortune. But the same truth is still true. As we face spiritual battles, we will find ourselves falling upon hard times. But the difference between the righteous man and the wicked, the difference between the one who has a relationship with God and the one who does not, is that we may seem like we have fallen. We may seem like we're in over our heads. We may seem like we can't handle the hardships we're in, but we will rise every time. God will always come through for us. He won't let us be tempted beyond what we can handle with his help. That never again means by ourselves, but with his help. And he will help us move forward. And so we can say, I may fall 7 times, but I'll rise again every time because I'm walking with God, because I have a relationship with him. Remember that every single time I have to make a heart choice. Don't just go through the motions. I think to myself, all right, what do I need to surrender? What do I need to believe God for? How can I make sure my heart is right with him in this? That's sort of like when you exercise. I've heard people say that when you exercise a lot, it's not just how long you do it, but it's how much do you keep good form? How much do you keep focusing on really putting all your effort into it and not going crazy, not doing things beyond what you're able to do, but putting all your effort into it and really having it intense. That makes the exercise work for you. The same thing is true spiritually. When I face a new trial or an old trial repeated, the question is, do I do it half-heartedly or I put all my heart into it? Do I say, God, I'm going to treat this like the first time it happened. I'm going to do everything I can to completely surrender this to you, to completely trust you, to have the very best attitude I can to respond. And as we do that again and again and again, sometimes, the same trial over and over and over, or as we do that with new trials in which he's graduating us to a new level, if we're just not discouraged but keep trusting that the testing of our faith is producing endurance and making us like Christ, that is a reason for us to count it all joy. Okay, I hope this will be an encouragement to you. Thanks.